very impressionable experience digging ditches in Honduras, which is just one of those like moments of realizing maybe I'm called to be some form of a bridge builder. There was something in that experience combined with, I think, you talk about your church in Aurora and how you were kind of between these like radically different worlds and also just radically different days, like what people's concerns were, the just so different in the nature of, frankly, the level of suffering, the communitarian versus individualistic, how we treat time. And I felt like that just in this brief experience in Honduras, seeing like levels of sort of poverty and chaos on the one hand, paired with extraordinary communitarian cohesion over and above sort of a set of American colleagues who were not at all sure how to handle, and myself somewhat included, how to handle the level of like impoverishment and gender relations and all that. Anyways, there's a lot of dynamics I could describe, but there was something in this very particular experience that was embodied, that was where I found myself in this position of kind of translating culturally and linguistically. And I view it as sort of like the beginning of, I don't know what this will look like in my life, but somehow maybe I've been given some tools and life experiences to exist on the borders between communities and help them understand one another, whether that's generational or social class or cultural or whatever. And that continues to be, I think, just like an inner drumbeat in me that I'm grateful kind of happened when I was in college at 19 in a way that was like outside of the cerebral seminar of Kierkegaard. I mean, there were relationships between what I was studying, but it was like, I really did not think I would end up in the intellectual sphere. When I left Wheaton, I was convinced I was going to like be very grassroots, like work in real communities, get my hands dirty, sleeves up. I didn't quite know what that would look like, and somewhat to my surprise, the only jobs that I could get immediately following were in this like weird world called the think tank world. So that's what I wound up in. And that was a journey of kind of, I was put with, in a program, a foreign policy program, as like a research assistant. And we worked with a lot of journalists and pretty sophisticated journalists. So that was kind of my exposure. The theory of change was like, if you can influence the media, hold events for them and educate them in that, at the time it was like a program related to Iran and Venezuela. And it was kind of random in retrospect. And I was very naive politically, as its own story. So I come to DC a bit like, this is the job that hired me. I like the idea. I had also been an international relations major in college. I like the idea of doing something global related. Maybe this could be a path to being in the foreign service. Like, you're just like open to whatever that rings at all of anything you've touched in your life. To my surprise, I wind up like hanging out with all these journalists all the time through this think tank program. And I just was so attracted to the ways in which they could be 70 years old and they were still so curious. They just had this lifelong learning zest about them that they weren't bored, basically. And there was just something about the earnestness with which they wanted to uncover reality. And of course, there's so much I could say about media now that I've been more in and out of it. And, so many dynamics have shifted over the last 20 years, particularly as media has become more, I think, politicized on all sides. But at the time, all I saw was people who really wanted to render an honest story. So that appealed to me, and I kind of migrated into the world of magazines and the newspapers in DC, and was still interested in bringing like a higher conceptual philosophical set of categories, but wasn't so interested in just having that rest at like systematic, broad-based, top-down levels. I wanted to be in real lives at gritty crossroads. So I got very interested in kind of what's happening as second, third, fourth generation immigrants in the US. How are they negotiating their identity? What are their trusted information channels? All of that. And so I was somehow had a few journalistic opportunities, basically freelance, people who found out of my background, and they were like, it seems like you could give us some insight into some of these different ethnic communities and at different generational levels in terms of how long they've been in the US. Could you write about why certain people are voting a certain way, or where people are trusting where information comes from? How are people finding out about job opportunities who are outside of the main dominant culture? So that was like all just felt like heaven to me, because I think it reminded me of growing the way I grew up, and I had sort of a grid for how certain communities, like a humble grid, not, it's not like had grown up in rural Korea and suddenly knew what it meant to be a 1.5 Korean immigrant, but there was enough in my own background, and I think just the dinner table I grew up in, that helped me basically have these just joy-filled interviews with people who would open up. And it actually really helped to be a person of faith. Like I was finding, I was working for pretty secular media outlets at the time, and there were very few journalists who had a transcendent frame of reference. It's a pretty secular workforce by and large. And I found that just believing in God helped me get into certain kinds of Buddhist temples and Hindu this, and of course, Vietnamese Jesuit communities and Korean Presbyterian and Nigerian Pentecostal. Like there was something about the religious understanding that both helped me ask questions in an interview that was sort of beneath the waves. It's hard to describe. And, I was welcomed into a very core civic institution, especially for those who were still first, second generation Americans, or, are still in that journey. There was a way in which, and I sometimes I'd like to tell more secular journalists this, like, not that this is going to compel them towards a faith journey, but I sometimes want to say, like, I feel like you're not trusted and you don't have access to what's actually going on in a variety of different ethnic communities and our burgeoning demographic unfurling in the US, because your frames of reference are all Harvard or are all, the debt ceiling, like there's a way in which if you're not able to sort of do the practices and share religious practice with another who's very different from you culturally, you're not really going to ascertain that much that could ever about a given community and how it operates. So I don't know if that makes sense, but it was kind of this like delicious secret I felt like I discovered. It gave me entree, surprisingly, into all kinds of people groups and their homes and hospitals and bedsides and mentoring. I mean, it was just really fascinating. So that, then I was given a chance, I did some writing on some of those dynamics around identity and how do you think about the traditions and the moral traditions you've inherited from your typically more conservative homeland, and then this individualistic, materialistic country called America. How do you negotiate? How do you handle your kids who are, if you're the first generation parent and you're watching them become more American, this is exactly what you want for them. At the same time, you're mourning the loss of certain values as you watch them kind of take on a more modern American consciousness. So all of that, and I was at a foundation in Texas, was intrigued by, I guess, what I was writing about, how I was writing about it, and invited me to come to Houston. And they were like, if you're really interested in these dynamics of America's demography and how it's shifting and which institutions are embracing those shifts and which are struggling, come to a city that is just exploding at the seams with I think at the time it was the most diverse, most languages in the US city in the country, which none of my New Yorker friends understood. I think they were like, Houston, that's like all cowboys, right? And I was like, actually, no, it really is the world. So I said yes. And that was a total adventure. And I got to tell all kinds of longer form, usually magazine stories, and was paid to do it. Had a steady way to put bread on my table by this foundation called the H.E. Butt Foundation, which also supports something some of your listeners may be familiar with called Laity Lodge in the Hill Country, which is sort of an ecumenical retreat center. So there was also like kind of a faith appreciation through that foundation as they were kind of experimenting with nonprofit journalism. And so none of these things would I have ever imagined when I was 18. Like, you don't know about these like weird career paths when you're young. And then, do you want me to keep going? I can speed up here.
First of all, I want to know why were your family in Hong Kong? I mean, go from Hong Kong, Australia. What were they doing?
My dad worked for a Boston-based bank in foreign exchange currency trading. So they were interested in having him start a branch of the bank in Hong Kong and then also in Sydney. And my mother had been the daughter of Bible translators / linguists in Peru. So we kind of had this, that was the other part of the background, was our apartments and our homes had a bit of this like Peruvian indigenous flavor from her growing up years in the Amazon, but our sort of external relations and friendships as a family, when we were living over there, were more kind of, cosmopolitan, diplomatic, finance, that sort of tier in Asia. So sort of like Latin America indigenous plus, Hong Kong global finance. Interesting. I don't know what else. It's sort of an interesting way to
it's very eclectic.
try to make sense of the world. It is eclectic. Yeah. Southern, Northern Hemisphere. Mm-hmm.